What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we're going to be going over 10 of the best decks currently in standard best of 1. I am going to be increasing it from the normal 5 to 10, though I am going to do things a little bit differently, as I'm just going to do more so just a quick overview of a deck instead of really going into the details of the decks, as I do think a lot of people at this point may have a better understanding of what decks currently are at standard. Some of them are ones that were in the last video, and to be quite honest, most of them haven't really changed positions of where they were ranked last time, but I decided to add in some of the other decks that also exist in Standard that are definitely good in certain matchups, which I do think, could be appealing to someone else who's not looking to play the top decks currently of the meta. But with that out of the way, let's just dive into the decks and let's just start talking about them. Just want to give a special shout out to the channel members here on my YouTube channel. You can also become a channel member yourself down below the video, hitting that join button. It definitely helps out a lot, and I just appreciate you guys for your support. So the first deck up on the list is going to be Mono Green. Mono Green's definitely been one of those decks that has been around for a while. It has gone through iterations as rotations have happened, but it's always kind of one of those decks that are in the meta when it comes to decks that are definitely competitive when it comes to playing them. It's not maybe right now in the spot where maybe once was, and roughly just over 50% win rate at 1,000 matches. And I do think that's because the meta is heavily in the mid-range, and that actually doesn't favor the Mono Green deck, as Mono Green really takes advantage when the meta is aggressive, as once you kind of get those bigger creatures out against those aggressive decks, Mono Green kind of takes over, because a lot of those aggressive decks can't really kill your bigger creatures, as they only play spot removal spells in their burn spells, which definitely gives them a hard time trying to get rid of those creatures. But nonetheless, I would say if the meta goes more into control to kind of combat the mid-range, Mono Green could still have a decent footprint overall, as I do think it could, as you would see more players play the aggressive decks to beat the control decks of the format. Mono Green's definitely in a position to definitely win games, and I would say, if you feel like you're playing against a lot of aggro, Mono Green's definitely a solid option to kind of combat that aggro. Though I would say it still struggles against the mid-range / the mono black aggro of the format, but still nonetheless, it's definitely a good deck that if you have the cards already or have the mythic and rare wild cards to check out, is definitely a fun one to probably check out and play. So the next deck up on the list is going to be Azorius Control. Azorius Control is definitely one of those decks that's kind of on the rise, just because it is kind of a good way to beat the more mid-range decks of the format, as it has a lot of ways to disrupt what your opponent is doing, and all it's trying to do is really grind out the games. As you kind of see, it's at a 53.6% win rate with 1,900 matches played, though I would say because it is a control deck, you do play longer games, and your average game duration is over 9 minutes. It's definitely an interesting pile if you're someone who likes to play control. It has a lot of ways to really just kind of stop whatever your opponent's doing, especially in that mid-range game, as we have counter spells, we have removal spells, we have a bunch of cards to draw cards from our deck to get that card advantage, which it kind of turns off Liliana for the most part. We have ways to exile things in like the Wanderer Emperor, the Farewell, and the Karn Silex. So I would say, if you are someone who's kind of annoyed with those mid-range decks of the format, especially mono black, this is definitely another good list to check out, as I do think this does have a lot of good tools and utilities that you can counteract whatever your opponent is doing when it comes to playing mono black. And for the most part, if anything, you at least frustrate your opponent long enough that they just maybe scoop if you're just kind of countering everything and they can't do anything. But nonetheless, it is not for everybody, as I would say control decks are for a certain type of player, as you kind of have to think not just for the current turn, but you have to think turns ahead. If I cast a certain spell now, where am I at in the next turn? Am I setting myself up for success? Though I would say if you are sick of playing the more mid-range decks out of the format, is definitely a good one to check out. And like I said, if the meta stays more mid-range, this is definitely a deck that is going to be able to beat that more mid-range format. The next deck up on the list is going to be Rakdos Sacrifice, and yet again, we are in a mid-range. We're in a mid-range kind of meta, and Rakdos Sacrifice is another great kind of deck to kind of counterbalance some of the other decks at the top of the meta, just because just like those decks, it can also grind out games. It plays a lot of good utility spells that kind of tries to overwhelm your opponent. It has a lot of good ways to utilize and create tokens with the Untitled Anvil. We have ways to kind of pain them as we make them, deal damage with the Obnix's ability. I would say overall, when it comes to the mana base and the cards that are in it, it's not as, expensive as some of the other decks of the format, outside of, the Obnixilus, the Meathook Massacres, and maybe the mana base and the Fable of the Mirror Breaker. The rest of the deck is commons and uncommons, which definitely makes it approachable. I would say if you're trying to build this physically, that's maybe a different story, as, Meathook Massacres, for example, and I think Obnixiluses are both kind of on the expensive side. But if you're talking in arena standards, it's just like the 1-for-1 when it comes to the wild cards that you would have. But overall, it's a deck that can drain games. I feel like I've maybe already talked about, the Rakdos Sacrifice a lot, as it is kind of one of my more favorite decks of the the meta, and it's been kind of that way since even before rotation happened. And at 54.1% win rate, I do think that's a decent amount of win rate to kind of have, especially if you're looking to climb and if you're looking to outgrind those other mid-range decks of the format. It's definitely a good deck to check out, and it's definitely a fun one to play if slowly draining your opponent with your drain spells and whatnot is a way you want to kind of slowly beat your opponent down. So the next deck up on the list is going to be Esper Zur. Definitely an interesting deck. Zur is this new creature from Dominaria United that for 2 mana you can make a target non-aura enchantment we control become a creature in addition to its other types. And its power and toughness are based on its converted mana cost. And this is definitely an interesting deck because we do play triomes in the deck to get the domain triggers for the Leyline Bind and essentially make it hopefully down to the point that it only costs 1 mana to cast at flash speed, which is definitely very good. But still, nonetheless, it's definitely a fun deck to mess around with in the current meta, as I do think if you have a creature on the battlefield that can turn enchantments into creatures that give those enchantments Death Touch, Lifelink, and hexproof until Zur leaves the battlefield, it definitely creates some problems for your opponent. And it is a solid mid-range deck, as it does play a lot of good tools and tricks to hopefully mitigate those early points of damage by playing a lot of one-drop removal, which is definitely not that bad. And it also tries to create some sort of board presence with the Wet Announcement, Spirited Companion, just to kind of counteract maybe your opponent's like Liliana triggers and things like that if you are playing against like mono black. It's a fun deck. It's definitely, a little bit on something like a little bit on the crazy side, I would say, just because the mana base is kind of out there when it comes to what it contains mana-wise. But it's still a fun deck that, does fairly well. 55.1% win rate in the current meta is definitely very good in 7,600 matches. And with about an average game duration of 7 minutes, I would say is definitely pretty good. And I would say, this is one of those games where it's a toss-up, maybe who would win between this and like a mono black deck for the most part. And it's definitely, I can see this deck being one of those decks that can kind of overwhelm your mono black opponent fairly easily, as it does have a lot of ways to get pressure on the battlefield pretty quickly. If they can't remove things on the battlefield, it's definitely GG's for them. And it's definitely one I would say to check out if you're looking to play a lot of new cards and do something a little bit differently than the other mid-range decks of the format. Now the next deck up on the list is another mid-range deck, just like the last one, though this one's more Esper mid-range. And what this one's trying to do is do some of the good things from like the mono black, maybe a little bit of the others or mid-range deck. But what it's trying to do here is it's trying to create a board presence and try to like overwhelm your opponent by playing a bunch of creatures that can easily drain them out. As you can kind of see here, we do play a little bit of spot removal. We try to play into like the Kaido, the Rafine. We also play Fairy Vandal. This is definitely another fun list, I would say, overall, compared to like maybe some of the other mid-range decks of the format. It is also a little bit on the expensive side, as there are a lot of powerful, expensive cards in this deck list. But still, nonetheless, this is definitely trying to do stuff, trying to annoy your opponent, create a decently wide board that your opponent's going to have to play a bunch of removal in order to really disrupt what you're trying to do here. We play things from Wet Announcement to Shieldred to Rafine to Obscura Interceptor to Urtide, Denic, Fairy Vandal. Like, there's a bunch of things that just creates a lot of pressure and a lot of things that your opponent has to deal with. And we also play our own ways of disruption that, pressure with things like Spell Pierce, Vortex, Cut Down, Make Disappears. Definitely have a lot of good utility. And, this is kind of like that cross balance between like a mid-range deck and a control deck. And I do see why it's a deck that is on the, maybe on the upward trend, just because it can kind of control even out a lot of the other mid-range decks of the format. At a 56.3% win rate is definitely pretty good. I mean, only 1,200 games played and 6 minutes average game duration, I still think is a very good position for a deck like this. You don't always have to play the top deck. Playing one of those decks that are maybe in the middle is definitely, not a bad place to start out with if you're looking to play something that's really not going to shift up or down based on, things that may adjust in the meta in case there are any bans or, restrictions in that sense. But still, nonetheless, it's a fun deck. It is expensive, like a lot of the decks on the meta, because the card pool is very small. It really makes those cards that are super powerful of the format kind of rise to the top, unfortunately, and that's why you see a lot of the decks here at the top, very rare and mythic focus for the most part. But it's definitely one of those things, as the card pool gets bigger and bigger, it's definitely one of those things we'll probably see kind of some decks kind of slowly thin out. And I would say even when that happens, this is definitely a deck that's still in a good position to do fairly well, just because I think it has a lot of good tools, and it's not playing a lot of tools from like one particular set. It's playing a bunch of tools from various sets. And I do think as the meta develops and we get a little bit further into standard in the coming months / the next year or so, I would say this is definitely going to be a list you're going to see probably on the meta for the most part, as I do think you'll probably just adjust a few things here and there. But for the most part, it does have a lot of the tools and utilities that I do think will make this this deck kind of last the stand of the rest of standard. So the next deck up on the list is going to be Mono Black Aggro. I know this is kind of like, very similar to the control version of the deck, but I do think the game plan is a little bit differently between the both, as this one's playing a very low curve, outside of like Shieldred. Everything else is 3 mana or less, which definitely makes it a very low explosive curve. Though what it's not doing compared to the other one, it's not sitting there trying to play the game out and grind you out. What it's trying to do is put a lot of pressure up early and making you have the answers for it, and if you don't, you kind of fall behind fairly easily. It's playing Cut Down, it's playing Infernal Grass, but it's not playing Meathook Massacre, it's not playing Evoke Despair. It is playing Liliana, though, it has a lot of good tools, and I do think it's kind of one of those decks that I do think, if you're looking for someone who's planning to play something aggressive, but in the way, you can play a little bit of a slower game, this is not a bad list to go with. If you're someone who's not looking to play Mono Black, I would say this is probably not your list then. But still, 58.5% win rate, it kind of speaks for itself. 5,700 matches played, 5.4 minutes played per match. Makes this kind of deck a reason why you probably see it a lot in the ladder, just because it's a great deck to climb with. The games don't last super long, and it does have a very cheap, curve for the most part, though I would say the deck is kind of on the expensive side, because outside of the couple, spot removal spells, this deck is a little bit heavy on the rares and mythics. But like I said, with the other decks that are like this, it happens when the card pool is very small. It's just playing the best cards of, the curve. And things could change as the meta develops. But still, nonetheless, Mono Black is kind of here in one way or the other. And Mono Black Aggro is definitely another deck that is kind of here and probably won't go away at any point, just because I do think this is kind of one of the ones that even does better against those more aggressive matchups of the format. So the next deck up on the list is going to be Rakdos Mid-range, and this is, to me, is kind of one of those decks that is kind of like, well, okay, we're playing the best spells from black, but let's also add the best spells from red, and that's kind of what this deck is, as this deck plays both Fable of the Mirror Breaker, it plays Invoke Despair, it plays Shieldred, it plays Bloodtithe Harvester, it has Liliana, it has all those good cards, and all that really is. I do think this is probably going to be the slightly better version of what may be in the meta as the meta develops, just because I do think unless something crazy happens, these cards will carry this deck throughout the rest of standard for the most part. Invoke Despair is a very explosive card. Liliana is very disruptive. Having good ways to spot removal early things on the battlefield is definitely very good, and putting pressure up early is another good thing that this deck does very good on. Though I would say the one thing it struggles on, if your opponent can grind a lot longer, this deck probably could fall behind, just because I do think, if you don't have pressure up, it's definitely going to be a little bit of a challenge, as this deck doesn't play a ton of creatures. So if you don't have creatures on the battlefield, you're not killing your opponent, and if you're not killing your opponent, you're just letting them kind of get back into the game. So I do think that's kind of where this deck struggles, but I do think this is a pretty solid deck from top to bottom. It's doing a bunch of different things, trying to disrupt what your opponent's doing, but also kind of grind them out and hopefully put enough pressure on them to finish off the game. I like this deck, though, like I said, if you're kind of sick of like playing mono black of any sort, this is probably not going to be a deck up your alley, as this is essentially just mono black with a splash of red. But still, nonetheless, it is a fun deck. There is a reason why it's a good deck. And like I said, if you're not seeing mono black, you're probably seeing something similar that's playing mono black, kind of similar to this. So the next deck up on the list is probably the only aggro deck that I really went over in this list, and that's gonna be mono red aggro. This is definitely another interesting list. It's kind of like one of those things that I don't think a lot of people really anticipate to be in kind of a top deck, just because, it got a few cards, but it doesn't have a lot of cards that really make it explosive. But still, nonetheless, it's definitely a good deck. It's playing a good swath of creatures and, spells to hopefully just burn your opponent down as quickly as possible. And that's kind of one of those other ways that you try to beat out the slower decks of the format, like a mid-range and a control. That if you have a decent fast start and put enough pressure on your opponent's life total, it definitely makes it hard for them to, catch back up unless they have a lot of life gain in their way. Because at that point, if they're down to like, 7 or 8 life points, you can hopefully maybe draw lucky or just get enough pressure back on the battlefield, even if they board wipe or remove stuff, to hopefully finish them off in that way. And having a lot of things that have haste and things that can get pumped and get really, really big, and having various ways to just kind of push through damage, even if it's not through combat damage, is definitely very good. I think the Raiju is a great card for this deck, as there's a lot of ways to give things modular. And then having ways to reoccur spells from the graveyard is also very good. But overall, this is a solid list. You see that it's at a 58.7% win rate, 1,200 matches played, 4.4 minutes per game, which is definitely very good. And you understand, and like, it's kind of one of those things, if you're in a format that's a little bit slower, an aggro deck that is kind of fast, like especially with haste, is definitely very good. I bet you this is probably a deck that definitely benefits if you're on the play compared to if you're on the draw, as you can be more explosive and your opponent doesn't have any mana open to really respond. So it's definitely makes it hard for a slower deck to kind of respond here. Like, they have to know that you're playing an aggro deck to really keep a hand that is that has removal and whatnot. So it definitely, causes problems. It causes disruption. It's also one of those decks too that you can throw at your opponent's face, and if you don't win, you scoop and you move on to the next one kind of thing. You just grind in a lot of games, and that's also why it probably has a decent high win rate, is because it can just play games quickly and just kind of grind out games, and kind of, your opponent may see a couple cards on the battlefield and like, I can't come out of this if they're at 12 or something like that, and they just kind of scoop. So definitely a good deck, definitely explosive. It's definitely a deck that, catches people off guard, because as the meta is super mid-range, playing a super aggressive deck like this is definitely something that people aren't expecting. So the next deck up on the list is going to be Selesnya Enchantments, and this is definitely one of those decks that I do think there's various iterations of. You see some that's more on the budget side that I've covered here in the past. You see this version, which is kind of more that mid-range side, trying to play, there's a lot of 2-drops here that kind of, pumps up creatures, and also things plays like Catilda and various things that kind of maybe disrupt the battlefield, but still push in through some big damage. And there's probably more of the slower version of the deck that plays more of the enchantments to then play their the 4-mana enchantment that Hallowed Haunting. Wherever you play an enchantment, you get a 1/1 creature token, then it gets additional +1/+1 for each other token that's on the battlefield. So I do think, this deck is, it has a place. It's kind of like the other aggressive deck of the format, because it has such a low curve that can get a lot of things out on the battlefield and kind of pump the creatures up to make it kind of hard for your opponent to really respond. And, has a lot of utility in the sense that it can, dig a little bit deeper into the deck. We have ways to, draw cards from the library if we need to. We have ways to remove things on the battlefield that are in our way. It definitely has a lot of good triggers. It's on the inexpensive side for the most part, compared especially to the rest of the decks, which makes it very approachable for a new player, as there aren't many rares and mythics. In most of the versions, I would say, most of the cards here are from Kamigawa, so when you play a deck that's all around one set, there are various rares that have good synergies with one another that are in a certain card type, which definitely makes it very easy to kind of collect cards from. And, for the most part, there really aren't any other cards outside of maybe the lands that are really from other sets in this deck, which definitely, like I said, makes it kind of easy to kind of build around. And, it's definitely, like the last deck, it is definitely a deck that, is in a position that does fairly well. I don't know why I decided to not take the screenshot, but I do think this is probably around like a 58 or 59% win rate. I don't know exactly what it's at, but it's a deck that's kind of been around, especially since rotation. It's kind of stuck its place kind of in the meta overall, but it's still nonetheless a good deck, though I would say, unfortunately, if you play this deck and you haven't experienced it yet, once you kind of get against like a mono black deck or a deck that has a lot of like spot removal, that's, I think, the only area where this deck kind of struggles with. But still, nonetheless, it is a good deck, especially for the cost that it takes to craft the deck itself. So the next deck up on the list is going to be mono white aggro, and I did cover this over in the last meta video, where mono white aggro was another top deck that was in the meta, and there are different variations of the deck. This is kind of like that low casting cost variation, with the only expensive card in the deck is Serra Paragon. And the reason why that's in the deck, especially in a meta where there's a lot of removal, is Serra Paragon allows us to kind of replay that stuff from the graveyard, which makes it amazing as long as our opponent doesn't play a Trespasser. It plays a lot of cards in the deck that hopefully disrupts what our opponent's trying to do. Outside of things like Thalia, which kind of taxes your opponent's non-creature spells. We have things like Anointed Peacekeeper to hopefully target a creature in particular from their hand, if not their deck, that slows down their plays, especially on curve. And then things like Brutal Cathar are also very good, because it just gets rid of creatures off the battlefield by, once it comes in the battlefield, it gets to just eat something, essentially, unless they remove Brutal Cathar from the battlefield. Then when it flips over, it has Ward of making them pay 3 life. So if you put enough pressure on your opponent, this is definitely a deck that definitely performs fairly well. This is sitting at 59.9% win rate in about 2,000 matches. Average game duration of 5.2 minutes. It is kind of on the expensive side. Most of the cards in the deck, outside of maybe, I guess, the lands and the one uncommon in the 1-drop slot, the rest of the deck is rares and mythics, so definitely not a deck for a person who's a little bit on the budget. But if you have some of these cards, because there's a good chunk of them that came from the previous standard and a splash of some of the newer cards, you could definitely maybe craft this deck. It's definitely a good deck. Is it the mono white of old? I would say no, but it's still nonetheless a good mono white deck in general that can put a lot of pressure on your opponent, frustrate your opponent, and kind of maybe make them scoop before you even have to attack them to dead. But still, nonetheless, it's definitely a good deck that I would say check out if you're looking to play something aggro that's not, the other typical aggro decks of the format. Now, I kind of want to do a couple honorable mentions just because I feel like these decks are good. I just didn't think, because they had less than 1,000 matches, I didn't want to put them on the list. So these ones are probably over 500, but below 1,000. The first one up is going to be Mono Blue blue Delver. This is definitely a deck that has kind of popped up as another deck that kind of just grinds out games, and all it really is trying to do is just trying to slow down your opponent in any ways possible. It plays a bunch of spells that are bounce spells, counter spells, ways to dig deeper into your deck kind of spells, things to phase things out spells. All it's really trying to do is just trying to build that board state, kind of slowly grind your opponent down until they don't really have any answers, and then you kind of drop things like Haughty Jin, you drop things like Delver's Secrets, you drop like Spectral Adversaries, a way to phase things out, and then also deposit mana into it to grow it bigger. It's just kind of one of those it's kind of one of those like tempo decks as you're just trying to look for your avenues to play things, but also leave protection up for your said things on the battlefield. And all in all, it's just, for the most part, this deck is really just more of that, draw, go kind of deck. And you're just, like I said, you're looking for those opportunities that if you play something, you have a way to protect said something and or stop maybe what your opponent's trying to do, and just kind of keep that board clean as much as possible until you can really get like a big Haughty Jin out on the battlefield, which definitely turns the deck on, because Haughty Jin will make all your instants and sorceries cost one less to cast if you have it on the battlefield. So it turns a lot of your counter spells into 1-mana counters and or 2-mana counters, which is definitely another good reason why this deck is also fairly good. It's a very low curve deck. It doesn't really, require a lot. Like I said, all you're really trying to do is just draw and go. It is 56.4% win rate, but like I said, it only has 680 matches played. It could change, based on how the meta goes. But I do think this is kind of one of those decks that's on the rise that will probably go over 1,000 matches and probably still sit somewhere around the 56 or 57% win rate. Though I would say the average game duration is not, this is not one of those decks that's going to win games quickly, but it is going to be one of those decks that once it gets to the win condition out on the battlefield, it's going to be really hard for your opponent to disrupt it. And, that's why I have it as one of my honorable mentions. The next deck up on the list as another honorable mention is going to be Jund Windgrace. And this is, yet again, just like the last one, this is another deck that I do think is on the rise. Jund is definitely another good mid-range deck. And this is definitely a cool, style reanimator deck, as we are playing things like Cruelty of Gix to get things like Titan of Industry out. We have Soul Windgrace, which gets lands back out from the battlefield. It has ways to grind out our opponent, has ways to kind of drain our opponent. And I would say this is the best compilation of a lot of things that are good mid-range wise. That definitely, are trying to slow the game down early, but also set up your late game. And it's definitely a deck that, once it gets the pieces going, it's definitely hard to stop. Soul Windgrace is a great card that I feel like is underappreciated, as it makes, throwing things into the graveyard very good with its ability, and then being able to get lands back on the battlefield when it comes out on the battlefield and or when it attacks is definitely very good. Having things like Titan of Industry is another great card, as it's a big 7/7 that, does two things depending on what the board state has on it or what your opponent's playing. So you destroy an artifact, you can gain 5 life, you create a 4/4 Rhino Soldier token, or you put a shield counter on target creature control. But like I said, this is a deck that just has a lot of good, powerful spells in it. And what this deck is trying to do is trying to counteract what, like the mono black decks of the format are trying to do. It may be a little bit tricky, maybe a little bit expensive. It's a deck that has a lot of rares, a lot of mythics in it. But it's not trying to do too much, but it's trying to do enough to kind of put pressure on the battlefield early, but then also really trying to set itself up for that nice late game. But like I said, this is another deck that I do think is on the rise. I don't think it just has enough matches currently to really know where it stands in the meta overall, and that's kind of why I have it in that honorable mention slot, as it is a deck that I do think will do well in this meta. It's just it hasn't, really played enough games to really know where it's going to fall when it comes to the other decks. Now, the next deck up on the list is going to be Grixis Vampires. This is another interesting deck that, just like the last one, this is another deck that I do think benefits from the new 3-color creature from Dominaria United. For some reason, the Dominaria United, or Untapped GG, wouldn't load the 5-drop, but I believe that's the Grixis color one that, you have the X abilities, and on the last ability that you give the opponent that creature. But for some reason, it wouldn't load that card, and I only own one copy of it in my collection. But still, nonetheless, is another, mid-range deck that's playing a lot of good, powerful spells. I would say it's a mid-range / control deck, as it has ways to disrupt what your opponent's doing, with make disappears, negates, and things like that. But it also plays things like Corpse Appraiser, which eats things from graveyards. It plays Urtai, which is a built-in creature counter spell. Bloodtithe Harvester makes the list as another good creature that is good aggressively as a creature. Then also combine that with Fabled Mirrorbreaker, makes it as a great removal spell. It does a lot of things good, especially against the other mid-range decks of the format, and it does play a lot of good, powerful cards overall. It's not a deck that's, very approachable in the sense that it's kind of on the expensive side, as the mana base is just full of rares and mythics and not many basics for the most part. And then the actual deck itself is just full of rares and mythics as well. Though there are a couple, commons and uncommons in there, and some of the removal spells and counter spells. It's just like the key pieces of the deck are actually like rares and mythics. But like I said with the last deck, this one's coming in at 55.2% win rate in 840 matches. A little bit slower at 6.7 minutes, but still, like I said, it is a deck that we hasn't played enough games to really know where I think it will fit in the meta. It's probably in somewhere in the top 10, but I don't know if it breaks that top 5 unless it trends upwards as if it does well enough against like the mono blacks of the format. But still, nonetheless, it's definitely a cool deck to check out if you're looking to do something that's outside of like the mono black decks of the format. And the last deck up is the one that you probably were expecting to be at the top of the list, and that is Mono Black Control. Just like Mono Black Aggro, it's another good deck. It has a lot of good spells in it. This one's built to grind out games, though I would say it struggles against the tempo style decks as it doesn't have a good way to reoccur a lot of things from the graveyard outside of like things like Soul Transfer. But nonetheless, it's still an overall good deck. 61.3% win rate is much higher than a lot of the other decks that were here on this video. I don't even think any of the other decks were even close to 60%. It has 7,500 matches played. Average game duration is about 5.9 minutes. This deck packs a punch in the 1-2-3 curve. Like you played Evolve Sleeper on turn 1, you play maybe Trespass, Tenacious Underdog on turn 2, follow that up with Liliana the Veil. And your opponent has to kind of figure out how to deal with all that board state fairly quickly, which could make it very difficult. Even if you like Evolve Sleeper on your turn, then Liliana Veil, that's still very good. You can then play into Graveyard Keeper, get a Shieldred out, you get Evoke Despair on turn 5. It has a lot of power in a very low curve overall. And I do think that's kind of why this deck is, overall very powerful. I think Munich Massacre is like the best removal that's currently in Standard. And then Evoke Despair is a great follow-up to that because it not only does it target a creature, it targets an enchantment, and it targets a planeswalker. That player would have it. So, it's a good 3-for-1. And most of the time, you really maybe get rid of one thing and you still, drain them for 4 life. You also get to draw 2 cards, which then works well with Shieldred, as Shieldred then would gain you 4 life in that process. It's a deck that is just overall very, very good and does a lot of things that are good, that counteracts a lot of what used to be good in the format. Cutdown's a great card. Infernal Grasp is a great card. Like, there's just a lot of things that you could look at and be like, wow, that's a great card, even by itself. And even when you look at decks that plays black, there's a lot of these cards that are in those decks just because those cards are that powerful. I mean, I would say that every deck that plays black plays that spot removal. It plays Munich Massacre. I would say there's a lot of decks that play Liliana the Veil. Maybe not Celestis, as Celestis is kind of like that card that's really more in the control style decks, as it's kind of like a good mana rock kind of thing. And if your opponent's not doing anything and it flips Day Night, you get to gain a life, draw a card, discard a card. And then Evoke Despair is like the big finisher of the deck. It's definitely a deck that is at the top of the meta. It hasn't been dethroned yet. I don't know if it will be dethroned before Brothers War comes out, but it's definitely a deck that there's a reason why it's here. It's just an overall powerful deck, and I've seen it in some of my videos before when I play other decks where people get frustrated about playing against Mono Black. And, it's definitely one of those things that if you're not going to be able to beat Mono Black, you either have to play it or try to make a complete anti-Mono Black deck, but that leaves you open for other decks of the meta, which definitely, will make you struggle. But, these are the decks that are currently in Standard. They're all doing fairly well. I don't have the links to all the decks in the description below. I'll have a link actually to the Untapped.gg profile where I pulled all these deck pictures if you want to check that out and kind of look at them yourself. I do think there's a lot you can look at on the website itself for free, even if you don't have a paid account. Though I do think the way it balances everything is between bronze and platinum, which it's still fairly good. It still shows you like how many games the deck has played, how it's performing overall win rate wise. You can check it out where the popularity is of said deck on the overall meta. You can check out their interpretation of a meta tier list as they kind of tier the decks based on various tiers if you want to see that. It's definitely a great tool. I'm not sponsored by them or anything. It's just a tool that I use, and it's how I collect a lot of these deck list videos when I do meta decks like this. As it is taking player data and it's kind of pulling it together and making a list overall. So overall, it's a great tool nonetheless. But if you like the video, hit that like button. It definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, you want to know I post new videos like this one, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next video.